But Richard was beyond reasoning. The combination of champagne, adrenaline, and the audience of Beverly Hills society had transformed him into a man determined to publicly humiliate his wife's ex-husband. Complicated? He laughed harshly. What's complicated about a man who chooses money over love? What's complicated about a husband who treats his wife like a business expense? Marcus felt his control beginning to slip. The years of meditation and martial arts discipline warred against a rising tide of anger and wounded pride. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the tent on him, waiting to see how he would respond to such a direct challenge to his character and masculinity. "Richard, please!" Catherine pleaded, reaching them just as her new husband delivered what he intended as the final blow. "The truth is, Chen, you never deserved Catherine in the first place. She's a beautiful, intelligent woman who needed a real man to appreciate her. Someone who understands that success means more than just making money. Someone who can satisfy her in ways you obviously never could." The implication in Richard's final words crossed a line that Marcus could not ignore. The sexual innuendo, delivered in front of Catherine and 200 guests, was designed to humiliate him completely. Marcus felt something snap inside his chest, a cord of restraint that had held firm through years of business negotiations and personal setbacks. "That's enough," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet but carrying to every corner of the tent. "I came here to wish Catherine well, but I won't stand here and let you make false accusations about our private life." Richard smiled triumphantly, sensing that he had finally provoked the reaction he wanted. "False accusations? Are you calling your ex-wife a liar? Because everything I know came directly from Catherine's lips during our intimate conversations." Catherine gasped audibly, her face going white with shock. "Richard, I never said anything like that. Those conversations were private, and you're twisting everything I told you." But the damage was done. Marcus could see the satisfaction in Richard's eyes, the knowledge that he had succeeded in publicly humiliating a man he saw as a threat to his new marriage. The guests watched in fascination and horror as the confrontation spiraled beyond the bounds of civilized behavior. Marcus made a decision that would change the trajectory of the evening. Instead of walking away or allowing security to escort him out, he stepped forward and issued a challenge that stunned everyone present. "If you want to settle this like men," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making million-dollar decisions, "then let's settle it properly, not with words and accusations, but with action." Richard's confidence faltered slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting we step outside and resolve this disagreement without involving Catherine or your guests any further. Just you and me, man to man." The tent erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Physical confrontations were not part of Beverly Hills wedding etiquette, but the drama had already moved far beyond normal social boundaries. Richard's sons moved closer to their father, clearly ready to intervene if necessary. "Dad, you don't need to prove anything to this guy," the elder son said. "Just have security throw him out." But Richard's pride had been engaged, and backing down now would look like cowardice in front of his new wife and all of Beverly Hills society. He had spent the last 10 minutes painting himself as the superior man, and refusing Marcus's challenge would undermine everything he had said. "Fine," Richard said, loosening his tie with hands that trembled slightly with adrenaline. "Let's step outside and finish this conversation properly." Catherine moved between them, her eyes filling with tears. "Please don't do this. Both of you are better than this. Richard, you're my husband now. Marcus, you're a successful businessman. This is insane." But both men were beyond rational argument. Years of resentment, wounded pride, and territorial instinct had taken over. The crowd began moving toward the tent's exit, drawn by the promise of witnessing something they would discuss for years to come. As they walked into the warm California evening, Marcus wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. But Richard's public humiliation had left him no choice but to defend his honor, regardless of the consequences. The manicured lawn behind the Beverly Hills Country Club stretched out like a green carpet, under the dim glow of Japanese lanterns strung between palm trees. The wedding guests formed a loose circle around Marcus and Richard, their formal attire creating a surreal backdrop for what was about to unfold. Catherine stood at the edge of the crowd, her wedding dress luminous in the moonlight, her hands pressed to her mouth in disbelief. Marcus removed his jacket and handed it to Jennifer, who accepted it with trembling hands. Underneath, his white dress shirt was tailored perfectly to his lean frame, the result of years of disciplined training and careful diet. At 38, he maintained the physical condition of a man 10 years younger, his movements fluid and controlled as he loosened his tie. Richard struggled slightly with his own jacket, his movements betraying the champagne he had consumed throughout the reception. At 53, he was still a formidable presence, his frame broadened by years of good living and occasional tennis matches. But there was a softness around his middle that spoke of boardroom lunches and country club dinners, a comfortable prosperity that had replaced the hunger of his younger years. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Catherine called out, her voice carrying across the lawn. "You're both acting like children. Richard, you're 53 years old and a respected businessman. Marcus, you built a company from nothing. Why are you letting this get so out of hand?" But neither man was listening to reason anymore. The confrontation had taken on a life of its own, fueled by wounded pride and the pressure of performing in front of Beverly Hills society. Marcus could see smartphones beginning to appear among the crowd, the new technology that would capture this moment for posterity. The thought of tomorrow's headlines flashed through his mind, but it was too late to back down now. "Last chance to walk away, Chen," Richard said, rolling up his sleeves to reveal forearms still thick with muscle despite his age. "I played football at USC back in the day. I'm not some computer nerd you can intimidate with your martial arts movies." Marcus said nothing, instead focusing on his breathing and centering his thoughts. His sensei, Master Tanaka, had always emphasized that true martial arts were about more than physical technique. They were about mental discipline, emotional control, and the wisdom to know when force was necessary and when it was not. Tonight felt like a failure of that wisdom, but Marcus had been backed into a corner by Richard's public humiliation. The crowd pressed closer, their excited whispers creating a buzzing energy that reminded Marcus of his tournament days. He had competed extensively in his 20s, winning several regional championships before focusing entirely on building his business. The muscle memory was still there, dormant but not forgotten, waiting to be awakened by necessity. "Gentlemen," called out Dr. Harrison Webb, Catherine's uncle and a respected physician, "this has gone far enough. If you insist on this foolishness, at least let me be present in case medical attention is needed." The comment sent a chill through the crowd as the reality of potential injury suddenly became clear. This was not a friendly sparring match between martial arts students. This was two successful men in their prime, driven by anger and jealousy, about to engage in combat with no rules or referee to protect them. Richard circled to his right, his movements telegraphing his football background. He moved like a linebacker, powerful but predictable, relying on size and strength rather than technique. Marcus recognized the pattern immediately and adjusted his stance accordingly, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, ready to move in any direction. "You know what your problem was, Chen?" Richard said, still trying to gain psychological advantage through words. "You never understood that marriage is about more than just providing financially. Catherine needed attention, romance, emotional connection, things you were too busy to give her." Marcus felt a familiar calm descending over him, the mental state his sensei had called mushin, mind without mind. The anger and hurt were still there, but they had transformed into focused energy, ready to be channeled through precise technique. He had learned long ago that emotion was the enemy of effective martial arts. "She told me about the nights you worked until 2 in the morning, Richard continued, his voice growing louder as he sensed his opponent's stillness. "She told me about the vacations you cancelled for business meetings. She told me about the anniversary dinner you missed because of some software emergency." Each accusation was true, and Marcus felt their weight even as he prepared for the inevitable physical confrontation. But he also remembered the context that Richard either didn't know or chose to ignore. The software emergency had been a critical bug that could have cost his company its biggest client. The cancelled vacations had saved jobs during a difficult economic period. The late nights had built the foundation for a business that now employed over 200 people. The crowd fell silent as Richard finally stopped talking and began his approach. His strategy was simple and direct. Use his size advantage to overwhelm Marcus before the smaller man could employ his martial arts training. He rushed forward with surprising speed for a man his age, his arms outstretched to tackle Marcus around the waist. But Marcus was no longer where Richard expected him to be. Years of karate training had taught him that the first rule of combat was never to be where your opponent thought you would be. He sidestepped smoothly to his left, his movement so fluid that it seemed almost like dancing. Richard's momentum carried him past Marcus, and he stumbled slightly on the manicured grass. The crowd gasped at the near miss, but Marcus made no move to capitalize on his opponent's temporary vulnerability. His sensei had taught him that true strength was shown through restraint, not aggression. "Come on, Chen," Richard shouted, his face flushed with exertion and embarrassment. "Stop running around and fight like a man." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "I didn't come here to fight, Richard. I came to wish Catherine well, but you've made it impossible for me to leave with my dignity intact." Richard charged again, this time more cautiously, his hands positioned to grab rather than tackle. But Marcus was ready for this approach as well. As Richard reached for him, Marcus executed a perfect Irumi movement, entering his opponent's space while simultaneously redirecting his energy. The result was that Richard found himself off balance and vulnerable, held in place by Marcus's superior positioning. For a moment, the two men were frozen in tableau. Richard's greater size neutralized by Marcus's technical skill, the crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Catherine broke the silence with a cry that carried all the pain and confusion of the evening. "Please stop this. Both of you! This isn't solving anything." But the confrontation had moved beyond the reach of rational appeals. Both men had invested too much pride and public reputation to back down now. As they separated and began circling each other again, Marcus realized that one of them would have to be decisively defeated before this could end. What happened next would surprise everyone present, including Marcus himself. Richard wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cool evening air, his breathing already labored from the two failed attempts to grapple with Marcus. The reality of facing a trained martial artist was beginning to dawn on him, but retreat was impossible with 200 guests watching his every move. His sons stood at the edge of the circle, their faces tight with concern as they watched their father struggle against an opponent who seemed to effortlessly counter every attack. Marcus maintained his centered stance, his breathing controlled and even. He could see the frustration building in Richard's eyes, the dangerous combination of wounded pride and growing desperation. In tournament fighting, this was often when opponents became most dangerous, when technique gave way to reckless aggression, fueled by the fear of losing face. "You think you're so superior with your fancy moves," Richard panted, loosening his tie completely and tossing it aside. "But let's see how well your karate works against good old-fashioned American determination." The crowd shifted nervously as Richard's demeanor changed. Gone was the calculated aggression of his first two attacks, replaced by something more primal and unpredictable. Marcus recognized the shift immediately. Richard was about to abandon any pretense of control and simply try to overwhelm him through brute force. Catherine pushed forward through the crowd, her wedding dress rustling against the perfectly trimmed hedges that bordered the lawn. "Richard, please!" "You're scaring me. This isn't who you are. You're a businessman, not a street fighter." But Richard was beyond hearing his new wife's pleas. The humiliation of being outmaneuvered twice in front of Beverly Hills society had triggered something deep in his psyche, a need to prove his masculine dominance that transcended rational thought. He began moving in a wider circle, his eyes never leaving Marcus, looking for any opening or advantage he could exploit. Marcus could feel the shift in energy from the crowd as well. What had started as shocked fascination was evolving into genuine concern for both men's safety. He caught sight of Dr. Webb speaking urgently into his cell phone, likely calling for paramedics as a precaution. The reality of potential serious injury was becoming undeniable. "You want to know what Catherine really told me about you?" Richard said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that somehow carried clearly across the lawn. "She told me that you were so obsessed with your computers that you forgot how to be human. She said making love to you was like being with a robot, technically proficient but completely without passion." The crowd gasped audibly at the intimate revelation. Catherine's face went white with shock and betrayal, her hands flying to cover her mouth. Even in his focused state, Marcus felt the words hit him like physical blows. The accusations struck at his deepest insecurities about his failed marriage, fears he had carried for 2 years about whether his driven personality had made him incapable of true intimacy. But instead of triggering the angry response Richard expected, the cruel words had the opposite effect. Marcus felt a strange sense of clarity wash over him, a sudden understanding that this confrontation was about more than just wounded male pride. Richard was not just fighting Marcus. He was fighting his own insecurities about replacing a younger, successful man in Catherine's affections. "You didn't need to say that," Marcus replied quietly, his voice carrying surprising compassion despite the circumstances. "Whatever problems Catherine and I had in our marriage, they don't justify humiliating her in front of all these people." Richard's face contorted with rage at Marcus's unexpected response. He had expected anger, defensiveness, or wounded pride, not this calm acceptance that somehow made him look even worse by comparison. The crowd was beginning to murmur among themselves, and Richard could sense their sympathy shifting away from him. "Don't you dare try to take the moral high ground now," Richard shouted, his control finally snapping completely. "You had 8 years to treat her right, and you failed. She chose me because I'm the better man." With that declaration, Richard launched himself forward in one final desperate assault. But this time, he was driven purely by emotion, with no strategy or technique to guide his attack. Marcus saw the charge coming from several seconds away, time enough to consider his options carefully. He could sidestep again, letting Richard's momentum carry him harmlessly past. He could use a simple hip throw to put the older man on the ground without serious injury. He could employ any number of defensive techniques that would end the confrontation, while preserving both men's dignity. Instead, Marcus made a choice that surprised everyone present, including himself. As Richard charged toward him, Marcus stepped forward to meet the attack head-on, but instead of using force to stop his opponent, he opened his arms and embraced Richard in what appeared to be a bear hug. The two men collided with surprising gentleness, Richard's momentum absorbed by Marcus's accepting stance. For several seconds, they stood locked together in what looked almost like a dance move, Richard's arms pinned at his sides by Marcus's encircling embrace. The crowd fell completely silent, confused by this unexpected development. "It's over, Richard," Marcus said quietly, his voice meant only for his opponent's ears. "We both love Catherine, and we both want her to be happy. That should make us allies, not enemies." Richard struggled briefly against the embrace, but Marcus's positioning made it impossible for him to generate any leverage. More importantly, the unexpected gesture of reconciliation seemed to drain the fight out of him as quickly as it had built up. "I don't understand," Richard whispered, his breathing still heavy from exertion. "Why aren't you fighting back? You could have hurt me badly by now." Marcus loosened his embrace slightly, but maintained control of the situation. "Because hurting you wouldn't prove anything except that I'm better at fighting. And Catherine already knows I'm good at competition. What she needed to see was whether I'm good at knowing when to stop competing." The profound simplicity of the statement rippled through the crowd, like a stone thrown into still water. Many of the guests began to understand that they were witnessing something far more complex than a simple fight between two men over a woman. Catherine pushed through the final ring of spectators, tears streaming down her face as she approached the two men who had shaped her adult life. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never said those things about you." Not the way Richard made them sound. "Our marriage had problems, but they were my fault too." Marcus released Richard completely and stepped back, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Richard stood swaying slightly, his expensive shirt wrinkled and stained with sweat, looking older and more vulnerable than he had at the beginning of the evening. But the night's surprises were far from over. The Beverly Hills Country Club lawn had become an amphitheater of stunned silence. 200 wedding guests stood frozen in place, their champagne glasses forgotten as they processed what they had just witnessed. Marcus Chen, the millionaire tech entrepreneur, had just diffused a violent confrontation through an act of unexpected compassion that left everyone questioning their assumptions about masculinity, competition, and conflict resolution. Richard Blackwood stood in the center of the circle, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The adrenaline was beginning to ebb from his system, leaving behind a cocktail of embarrassment, confusion, and something that felt disturbingly like respect for the man he had been trying to humiliate moments earlier. Catherine moved between the two men like a ghost in white silk, her wedding makeup streaked with tears that caught the light from the Japanese lanterns. The fairy tale evening she had planned so carefully had transformed into something that would be discussed in Beverly Hills drawing rooms for years to come. "I need to explain something," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying clearly across the lawn. To both of you, and to everyone here who just witnessed this insanity. Marcus retrieved his jacket from Jennifer, who handed it to him with shaking hands. As he slipped it back on, he noticed that his white shirt was barely wrinkled despite the confrontation. His karate training had taught him efficiency of movement, wasting no energy on unnecessary actions. "Catherine, you don't owe anyone an explanation," Marcus said gently. "This is your wedding day. These people are here to celebrate your happiness, not to judge your past." But Catherine shook her head, her blonde hair catching the moonlight as she turned to address the crowd. "No, Marcus. After what just happened, after the things that were said, everyone deserves to understand the truth." Richard's sons approached their father cautiously, their faces etched with concern. The elder son, Robert, placed a protective hand on Richard's shoulder. "Dad, maybe we should go inside. Get you some water and a chance to cool down." "No," Richard said, his voice hoarse but firm. "If Catherine wants to speak, then I need to hear what she has to say. I need to understand how I got so carried away tonight." Dr. Webb stepped forward from the crowd, his medical bag in hand. "At minimum, I should check both of you for injuries. That was a highly unusual confrontation, but physical stress is still physical stress." Marcus waved him away politely. "I'm fine, doctor. Thank you for your concern." Richard nodded his agreement, though he was still breathing heavily. "I'm all right as well, just confused about what exactly happened out here." Catherine moved to the center of the circle, her wedding dress rustling softly against the manicured grass. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of a woman who had found her courage in the midst of chaos. 8 years ago, I married Marcus Chen, she began, her eyes moving between her ex-husband and her new husband. I was 25 years old, fresh out of college, and completely unprepared for what it meant to be married to someone with his ambition and drive. The crowd leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the intimacy of her confession. This was no longer a public spectacle. It had become something more like group therapy conducted under the stars. Marcus worked 18-hour days building his company. Catherine continued. He missed dinners, anniversaries, birthdays. He was physically present, but emotionally absent for months at a time. And yes, it hurt. It hurt terribly. Marcus felt each word like a small blade, but he forced himself to listen without defending or deflecting. This was Catherine's truth, and she deserved to speak it without interruption. "But what I never told anyone," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger, "was that I never asked him to change. I never told him how much his absence hurt me. I was so young, so afraid of seeming needy or demanding, that I suffered in silence and expected him to read my mind." Richard's face went pale as he began to understand the implications of what his new wife was revealing. The simple narrative he had constructed, the neglectful husband, the suffering wife, the rescuing knight, was crumbling before his eyes. "I told myself that if Marcus really loved me, he would notice my unhappiness and fix it without being asked," Catherine said, tears beginning to flow freely down her cheeks. "I turned our marriage into a test that he couldn't possibly pass because I never told him what the test was." Jennifer stepped forward, her bridesmaid dress bright against the dark lawn. "Catherine, you don't have to do this. Not here, not now." But Catherine held up a hand to stop her sister's intervention. "Yes, I do, because what happened here tonight is my fault as much as anyone's. Richard, when we were dating, I told you stories about my marriage that were true but incomplete. I let you believe that Marcus was a villain when the truth was much more complicated." Richard's voice was barely audible when he spoke. "You told me he ignored you. You told me he chose work over you every single time." "And those things were true," Catherine admitted. "But I never told you that he was building something revolutionary, something that would eventually employ hundreds of people and change how businesses manage information. I never told you that he asked me dozens of times to be more involved in his work, to understand what he was trying to accomplish. I never told you that I chose to feel sorry for myself instead of choosing to be his partner." The confession hung in the night air like a challenge to everyone present. Marcus felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness wash over him. For 2 years, he had wondered if he was truly the selfish monster that his divorce had made him feel like. But hearing Catherine's words brought no satisfaction, only a deep regret for the communication failures that had destroyed their marriage. "Catherine," Marcus said softly, stepping toward her carefully, "you were 25 years old and trying to figure out how to be married to someone who barely knew how to be married himself. We both made mistakes. Richard watched the exchange between his new wife and her ex-husband with growing understanding. The jealousy and territorial aggression that had driven him to public confrontation seemed suddenly petty and misguided. "I need to apologize," Richard said, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "To both of you, and to everyone who had to witness my behavior tonight. I let my own insecurities turn what should have been a celebration into a public humiliation." The crowd stirred uncomfortably, unsure how to respond to such raw honesty from people they had known primarily through their public personas. Beverly Hills society was built on maintaining graceful facades, and the evening's revelations had stripped away those protective layers with surgical precision. Marcus looked around the circle of faces, recognizing business associates, social acquaintances, and members of the community where he had lived for over a decade. These people would remember this night for the rest of their lives, and the story would be told and retold until it became legend. But something else was happening as well, something none of them had expected when the confrontation began. The transformation of the Beverly Hills Country Club lawn from a scene of potential violence to an impromptu forum for emotional honesty had created an atmosphere unlike anything the assembled guests had ever experienced. What had begun as a wedding reception had evolved into something resembling a community healing circle, with 200 of Los Angeles's most successful people standing witness to truths that were rarely spoken aloud in their carefully curated world. Dr. Webb had quietly moved through the crowd, his medical training making him sensitive to the psychological impact of what was unfolding. Several guests were visibly emotional, tears glistening on the faces of both men and women who had recognized elements of their own relationships in Catherine's painful confession. Marcus felt a strange sense of liberation as he looked around the circle of faces. For 2 years since his divorce, he had carried the weight of being perceived as the villain in his marriage's failure. The whispered conversations at business functions, the pitying looks from mutual friends, the assumption that his success had come at the cost of his humanity. All of it had shaped his interactions with the world around him. "There's something else I need to say," Catherine announced, her voice growing steadier as she found her courage. "Something that might help other people avoid the mistakes Richard and I almost made tonight." Richard stepped closer to his new wife, his earlier aggression replaced by a protective instinct. Despite everything that had happened, she was still his bride, and he could see the toll that her public confession was taking on her emotional reserves. "When Richard and I started dating," Catherine continued, "I thought I had learned from my marriage to Marcus. I thought I understood what I needed in a relationship. But the truth is, I was still making the same mistake. I was expecting someone else to fix problems that I needed to address in myself." The crowd shifted slightly, many guests unconsciously moving closer as Catherine's words resonated with their own experiences. In a community where divorce rates exceeded 50%, her insights were striking uncomfortably close to home for many couples present. "I told Richard stories about Marcus that made him feel like he needed to rescue me," Catherine said, her eyes meeting her new husband's gaze directly. "I let him believe that my unhappiness in my first marriage was entirely Marcus's fault. But the truth is, I never learned how to communicate my needs clearly. I never learned how to be a true partner instead of a passive victim." Jennifer moved closer to her sister, offering silent support as Catherine continued her painful self-examination. The bridesmaid's dress that had seemed so cheerful hours earlier now felt like a costume for a play that had taken an unexpected dramatic turn. Marcus found himself remembering conversations from their marriage that took on new meaning. In light of Catherine's revelations, the subtle hints he had missed, the emotional cues he had been too busy or too focused to interpret correctly. But he also remembered his own attempts to include her in his work, invitations to company events that she had declined, explanations of his business challenges that she had seemed uninterested in hearing. "The irony," Catherine said, her voice cracking slightly, "is that Richard is actually very similar to Marcus in many ways. He's driven, successful, passionate about his work. The difference is that I'm older now, and I thought I was wiser. But instead of learning to communicate better, I just found someone who was willing to compete with the ghost of my first husband." Richard's sons exchanged glances from their position at the edge of the crowd. They had watched their father's courtship of Catherine with some concern, noting his unusual intensity about proving himself superior to her ex-husband. But they had attributed it to the normal challenges of marrying someone who had been previously married. "Dad," Robert called out softly, Maybe we should take this conversation somewhere more private. But Richard shook his head, his earlier embarrassment transforming into something that looked almost like gratitude. No, son, if Catherine is brave enough to tell the truth in front of all these people, then I need to be brave enough to hear it. Marcus watched the interplay between the Blackwood family with growing respect for the man he had been ready to fight moments earlier. Richard's willingness to examine his own behavior publicly showed a strength of character that Marcus had not expected from someone who had seemed so driven by ego and territorial aggression. Richard, Catherine said, turning to face her new husband fully. When I told you about Marcus, I should have been honest about my own role in our marriage's problems. Instead, I let you believe that you were saving me from someone who had treated me badly. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to Marcus. The crowd was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in their social circle. Public confessions of marital difficulties were rare in Beverly Hills, where maintaining appearances was often considered more important than addressing underlying problems. Dr. Webb stepped forward slightly, his voice gentle but authoritative. Catherine, what you're doing takes tremendous courage, but you should know that everyone here tonight has been affected by what they've witnessed. This kind of honesty can be healing, but it can also be overwhelming. Marcus looked around the circle of faces and saw that Dr. Webb was right. Some guests were crying openly, clearly processing their own relationship challenges. Others looked shell-shocked, as if the evening's revelations had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about their own marriages. Maybe we should continue this conversation inside, Marcus suggested, concerned about the emotional impact on the wedding guests. These people came here to celebrate, not to participate in group therapy. But Mrs. Davidson, Catherine's mother, stepped forward from the crowd. At 62, she had the regal bearing of someone who had navigated Beverly Hills society for decades, but her voice carried the wisdom of a woman who had learned hard lessons about marriage and relationships. No, she said firmly. I think we all needed to hear this. My generation taught our daughters to be passive in their marriages, to expect their husbands to be mind readers. We taught them that asking for what they needed was somehow unfeminine or demanding. The older woman's words sent a ripple of recognition through the crowd. Many of the women present, regardless of their age, nodded in understanding as they recognized the patterns Mrs. Davidson was describing. Catherine, her mother continued, you're not just helping yourself and Richard and Marcus tonight. You're helping every couple here who has struggled with the same communication problems. Marcus felt a profound shift in his understanding of what was happening around him. What had started as a personal confrontation between two men was evolving into something much larger, a community reckoning with the hidden, dynamics that destroyed relationships throughout their social circle. But the night's most surprising revelation was still to come. As Catherine's mother finished speaking, a gentle murmur of agreement rippled through the assembled guests. The Japanese lanterns swayed slightly in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows across faces that had been transformed by the evening's unexpected emotional journey. What had begun as a traditional Beverly Hills wedding reception had become something unprecedented, a community-wide examination of the hidden fractures that existed beneath the polished surface of their successful lives. Marcus noticed that several couples in the crowd had moved closer together, hands finding hands, as the evening's revelations prompted them to examine their own relationships. The confrontation that had threatened to destroy the wedding was somehow bringing people together in ways that traditional social events rarely achieved. Richard stood in the center of the circle, his expensive wedding attire wrinkled and his silver hair disheveled, but his posture had changed completely from the aggressive stance he had maintained earlier. The transformation was remarkable, from territorial aggressor to thoughtful participant in a conversation that was affecting everyone present. I need to tell all of you something, Richard said, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn. Something that might explain why I reacted so strongly tonight, and why this conversation is more important than any of you realize. Catherine looked at her new husband with surprise and concern. In their 2 years of dating and 6 months of engagement, Richard had always presented himself as supremely confident, a man who had learned from his first marriage and was ready to get everything right the second time around. My first wife left me 15 years ago, Richard continued, his honesty matching Catherine's earlier confession. We were married for 18 years, and I thought we had a solid relationship. We never fought. We maintained a beautiful home. We were successful by every measure that our community respected. The crowd listened intently, recognizing the pattern Richard was describing. Many of them lived similar lives, prosperous, well-organized, and emotionally distant relationships that looked perfect from the outside but lacked genuine intimacy. The morning she left, Margaret told me that she felt like she'd been married to a successful stranger for nearly 2 decades, Richard said, his voice growing quieter as he recalled the painful memory. She said that I was an excellent provider, a reliable partner, and a complete mystery as a human being. Marcus felt a jolt of recognition at Richard's words. The accusation was remarkably similar to what Catherine had implied, about their own marriage. The successful man who had forgotten how to be emotionally present with the woman he claimed to love. When I met Catherine, Richard continued, I was determined to prove that I could be different. But instead of actually learning to be more emotionally available, I focused on being better than her ex-husband. I turned our relationship into a competition with a man I had never met. Dr. Webb nodded knowingly from his position in the crowd. As a physician who had counseled many couples over the years, he recognized the pattern Richard was describing. The second marriage that was built on reaction to the first marriage's failures rather than on its own foundation. Tonight, when I saw Marcus at our wedding, all of my insecurities came flooding back, Richard admitted. Here was this younger, successful, physically fit man who had once been married to my wife. Instead of seeing him as a guest who had come to wish Catherine well, I saw him as proof that I might not be enough for her. Catherine moved closer to Richard, her wedding dress rustling softly against the grass. Richard, you never told me about feeling insecure. In all the time we've been together, you've always seemed so confident, so sure of yourself. Because I was afraid that if you knew about my doubts, you would leave me the way Margaret did, Richard replied. I thought that projecting confidence was the same thing as actually being confident. The conversation was revealing patterns that extended far beyond the 3 people at its center. Marcus looked around the circle of faces and saw recognition in the eyes of many guests. The understanding that they, too, had been performing versions of themselves rather than revealing their authentic personalities to their partners. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Mrs. Davidson said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had observed relationship patterns for decades. We teach our children to present perfect images instead of teaching them to be genuinely intimate. We create marriages that look successful but feel empty. Jennifer stepped forward, her bridesmaid's dress bright against the evening darkness. Catherine, remember what Mom used to tell us when we were teenagers? A lady never shows her emotions in public. We were taught that being vulnerable was the same thing as being weak. The observation sparked nods of recognition from many of the women in the crowd. The social conditioning that had shaped their generation's approach to relationships was being examined under the harsh light of lived experience. Marcus found himself speaking before he had consciously decided to share his own insights. The strange thing is, I built my entire business on clear communication and precise problem solving. But somehow I never applied those same skills to my marriage. I treated my relationship with Catherine like it should maintain itself automatically while I focused on other challenges. That's exactly right, Catherine said, turning to face her ex-husband. You were brilliant at identifying problems in your business and creating solutions. But when problems arose in our marriage, you seemed to assume they would resolve themselves without direct attention. Richard listened to the exchange between Catherine and Marcus with growing fascination. Instead of feeling jealous or threatened by their obvious ability to communicate effectively, he found himself curious about what he could learn from their insights. Can I ask you something, Marcus? Richard said, his earlier antagonism completely replaced by genuine interest. When you realized that your marriage was in trouble, what did you wish you had done differently? The question surprised everyone present, including Marcus himself. The idea that Richard would seek relationship advice from the man he had been ready to fight was so unexpected that several guests audibly gasped. Marcus considered the question carefully, aware that his answer would be heard by 200 people who might benefit from his hard-won wisdom. I wish I had learned to prioritize emotional presence the same way I prioritized financial success. I wish I had understood that building a marriage requires the same kind of daily attention that building a business requires. Richard nodded thoughtfully. And Catherine, what do you wish you had done differently in your marriage to Marcus? Catherine's answer would change the trajectory of the evening once again, leading all 3 of them toward an understanding that none of them had anticipated. Catherine stood in the center of the circle, her wedding dress luminous under the starlit sky. As she contemplated Richard's question, the weight of 200 expectant faces pressed upon her. But she had moved beyond the fear of judgment that had controlled so much of her life. The evening's revelations had stripped away the protective layers of social pretense, leaving room for the kind of radical honesty that rarely emerged in Beverly Hills drawing rooms. I wish I had been brave enough to tell Marcus exactly what I needed instead of hoping he would figure it out on his own, Catherine said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. But more than that, I wish I had been brave enough to become the kind of person who could be a true partner to someone with his ambition and drive. Marcus felt his chest tighten at her words. For 2 years, he had carried the burden of believing that his focus on building his business had been fundamentally selfish, a choice that had destroyed his marriage through neglect and emotional unavailability. But Catherine's confession suggested a more complex dynamic. What do you mean by that? Dr. Webb asked gently, his medical training making him sensitive to the therapeutic potential of the moment. Catherine looked around the circle of faces, seeing not just wedding guests, but a community of people who had struggled with similar challenges in their own relationships. I mean that I was so focused on what Marcus wasn't giving me that I never asked myself what I was bringing to our partnership. I wanted to be loved and cherished, but I never learned how to love and cherish in return. The confession sent a ripple of uncomfortable recognition through the crowd. Many of the guests had built their lives around the expectation of being provided for, protected, and emotionally managed by their partners, without considering what they contributed to the relationship's success. Richard found himself nodding as Catherine's words resonated with his own experience. That's exactly what Margaret told me when she left. She said that I had treated our marriage like a service contract. I provided financial security and social status, and she was supposed to provide domestic management and emotional support. But neither of us ever learned how to actually connect with each other as human beings. Marcus listened to the exchange with growing amazement. The confrontation that had begun with accusations and territorial aggression was evolving into the kind of honest dialogue about relationships that he had never experienced, even in professional therapy sessions during his divorce. There's something else, Catherine said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried clearly across the lawn. Something I've never told anyone, not even my therapist. Jennifer moved closer to her sister, sensing that Catherine was about to reveal something profound. The crowd seemed to lean forward collectively, drawn by the intimacy of the moment. The reason I really divorced Marcus wasn't because he worked too much or ignored me, Catherine said, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. It was because I was terrified of how much I loved him. I was terrified of becoming the kind of person who could match his intensity and passion for life. The revelation struck the assembled guests like a physical blow. This was not the story of neglect and abandonment that Beverly Hills society had constructed around the Chen divorce. This was something far more complex and psychologically challenging. I convinced myself that Marcus was the problem because facing the truth about myself was too scary, Catherine continued. The truth was that I had never learned how to be passionate about anything. I'd been raised to be pleasant, agreeable, and decorative, but Marcus needed a partner who could share his vision, challenge his ideas, and match his commitment to building something extraordinary. Marcus felt tears forming in his own eyes as he finally understood the dynamic that had destroyed their marriage. He had assumed that Catherine's withdrawal from their relationship was a rejection of his ambition and work ethic, but her confession revealed that it had been a retreat from the challenge of becoming someone worthy of the life he was trying to build for them. So instead of rising to meet that challenge, Catherine said, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to complete her confession, I made Marcus the villain. I told myself that he was asking too much, that he should love me exactly as I was without expecting me to grow or change. But the truth is, love requires growth. Real partnership requires becoming the best version of yourself. Richard stood transfixed by his new wife's revelation. In 2 years of courtship, he had seen glimpses of the passionate, intelligent woman that Catherine could become. But she had always pulled back when their conversations became too intense or challenging. Now he understood why. Catherine, Richard said softly, are you telling me that our entire relationship has been built on the same foundation as your marriage to Marcus? That you've been hiding from becoming the person you're capable of being? The question hung in the night air like a challenge that would determine the future of their marriage before it had truly begun. The crowd held its breath, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would either destroy the Blackwood union or transform it into something unprecedented? Catherine looked directly into Richard's eyes, her expression reflecting a courage that surprised even herself. "Yes," she whispered. "I married you because I thought you would let me stay small and safe. I thought you would be content with the pleasant, agreeable version of myself that I've been performing for most of my adult life." The honesty of her admission sent shockwaves through the assembled guests. Many couples found themselves looking at each other with new understanding, recognizing similar patterns in their own relationships. But Richard's response surprised everyone present, including Catherine herself. Instead of anger or hurt, Richard began to laugh, not with bitterness or sarcasm, but with genuine amusement and relief. The sound carried clearly across the lawn, breaking the tension that had held the crowd in suspended animation. "Do you know what the strangest part of this evening has been?" Richard asked, his laughter subsiding into a warm smile. "The strangest part has been discovering that Marcus Chen is exactly the kind of man I would want as a friend. And you, Catherine, are exactly the kind of woman I fell in love with. Not the safe, agreeable version, but the passionate, complicated, challenging person you've been afraid to show me." The unexpected turn in Richard's response created a moment of profound possibility. What had begun as a wedding day disaster was transforming into an opportunity for all three of them to build relationships based on authenticity rather than performance. But the evening's final surprise was still waiting to unfold. The sound of Richard's laughter had broken something fundamental. In the atmosphere of the Beverly Hills country club lawn, what had been a tense, emotionally charged confrontation transformed into something that felt almost celebratory, as if the three people at the center of the drama had finally found a way forward that none of them had imagined possible. Marcus found himself smiling despite everything that had transpired. The man he had been prepared to fight was revealing himself to be someone with depth, wisdom, and the kind of emotional courage that Marcus respected deeply. The territorial aggression and wounded pride that had driven their earlier confrontation seemed to belong to a different evening entirely. "Richard," Marcus said, extending his hand in a gesture that mirrored his earlier attempt at reconciliation. "I owe you an apology. I came here tonight thinking I understood the dynamics between the three of us, but I was wrong about almost everything." Richard accepted the handshake, but instead of the formal gesture Marcus had intended, he pulled the smaller man into a brief embrace that surprised both of them. "We both owe each other apologies," Richard replied, "and we both owe Catherine our gratitude for having the courage to tell us the truth about ourselves." The crowd watched this unexpected reconciliation with fascination and growing hope. Many of the couples present had been affected by the evening's revelations about communication, authenticity, and the courage required for genuine intimacy. Seeing three people work through such complex relationship dynamics in real time was providing a masterclass in conflict resolution that would influence their own marriages for years to come. Catherine stood between the two men who had shaped her adult life, her wedding dress now slightly wrinkled, but her posture reflecting a new kind of confidence. The woman who had begun the evening, hiding behind pleasant social conventions, had been replaced by someone willing to confront difficult truths about herself and her relationships. "There's something I need to ask both of you," Catherine said, her voice carrying a note of determination that neither man had heard before. "Something that might sound crazy given everything that's happened tonight." Dr. Webb stepped closer, his medical instincts alert to the possibility that the evening's emotional intensity might be overwhelming Catherine's capacity for rational decision-making. "Catherine, you've been through a tremendous amount tonight. Perhaps some of these conversations would be better continued after you've had time to process everything." But Catherine shook her head firmly. "No, Dr. Webb, I've spent too many years avoiding difficult conversations. If I don't say this now, I might lose the courage to say it at all." Jennifer moved to her sister's side, offering silent support as Catherine prepared to voice whatever request was forming in her mind. The bridesmaid's dress, that had seemed so cheerful hours earlier, now felt like a costume for a play that had taken multiple unexpected turns. "Marcus," Catherine said, turning to face her ex-husband directly, "I know this is going to sound strange, but I need to ask you something. After everything we've learned about ourselves tonight, after all the honesty we've shared, would you be willing to try again? Would you be willing to see if we could build the kind of partnership we were both too scared to create the first time?" The question sent a shockwave through the assembled guests that was even more powerful than the evening's earlier revelations. Catherine was asking her ex-husband to reconcile with her on her wedding day, in front of 200 witnesses, and in the presence of the man she had just married. Marcus felt the world tilt slightly as he processed what Catherine was asking. Every rational part of his mind recognized the impossibility of what she was suggesting, but he could not deny the powerful attraction of the idea. The woman standing before him was not the passive, agreeable person he had been married to for 8 years. This was someone with the courage to examine herself honestly and the strength to ask for what she truly wanted. But before Marcus could respond, Richard stepped forward with an expression that combined pain, understanding, and something that looked remarkably like relief. "Catherine," Richard said gently, "I need to tell you something that I should have said months ago, something that might make your decision easier." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that Richard was about to reveal something that would complete the evening's pattern of radical honesty. The Japanese lanterns swayed in the evening breeze, casting dancing shadows across faces that had been transformed by witnessing truths that were rarely spoken aloud in their social circle. "I've known for a long time that you were still in love with Marcus," Richard said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was admitting. "I could see it in the way you talked about him, the way you compared every decision we made to what he might have done. I told myself that I could make you forget him, that I could be enough to fill that space in your heart." Catherine's face went pale as she realized that her carefully guarded secret had been transparent to the man she had married. "Richard, I'm so sorry. I never meant to." But Richard held up a hand to stop her apology. "Don't apologize for loving someone. Apologize for not being honest about it. Apologize for marrying me when you knew your heart belonged to someone else." The painful honesty of Richard's admission created a moment of profound silence on the lawn. 200 guests stood witness to a level of emotional courage that most of them had never seen displayed publicly. The man was voluntarily releasing his claim to a woman he loved because he recognized that love required truth rather than possession. Marcus looked at Richard with growing respect and something that felt like fraternal affection. The older man was demonstrating a form of masculine strength that had nothing to do with physical dominance or competitive victory. This was the strength of someone willing to sacrifice his own desires for the authentic happiness of someone he cared about. "Richard," Marcus said quietly, "what you're doing right now takes more courage than anything that happened between us earlier tonight. But I need you to know that whatever Catherine decides, you've earned my respect and admiration." Richard smiled sadly but genuinely. "Thank you, Marcus. That means more to me than you might realize." But the evening's final surprise was about to emerge from an unexpected source, changing the trajectory of all their lives in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Catherine stood in the center of the circle, her white wedding dress catching the moonlight as she looked between the two men who had just demonstrated levels of emotional maturity and courage that surpassed anything she had imagined possible. The evening had transformed all three of them, stripping away pretense and revealing truths that would reshape their understanding of love, commitment, and authentic partnership. But as she prepared to respond to Marcus's unspoken question and Richard's generous offer of release, Catherine realized that the most important revelation of the night was still forming in her mind. The conversations, confessions, and confrontations had led her to an understanding that would surprise everyone present, including herself. "I need to tell both of you something," Catherine said, her voice carrying a new quality of certainty that neither man had heard before. "Something that I've only just realized in the last few minutes, while listening to all of us tell the truth about ourselves for the first time." The crowd leaned forward collectively, sensing that Catherine was about to provide the resolution to an evening that had challenged everything they thought they understood about relationships, commitment, and the nature of love itself. "Marcus," Catherine said, turning to face her ex-husband, "you asked me once, during our divorce, what I would have needed from you to save our marriage. I told you then that I needed more attention, more emotional presence, more romance. But I was lying." Marcus felt his chest tighten as he prepared to hear another painful truth about his failures as a husband. But Catherine's next words surprised him completely. "What I really needed was the courage to become someone worthy of the extraordinary life you were building for us." Catherine continued, "I needed to stop being afraid of my own potential and start matching your passion with my own. But I was too scared to try, so I made you the villain instead." She turned to Richard, her expression filled with compassion and regret. And Richard, when I met you, I thought I had found someone who would let me stay safe and small. Someone who wouldn't challenge me to grow beyond my comfortable limitations. But tonight, watching you have the courage to let me go, I realize that you deserve someone who can match your emotional bravery with her own. The assembled guests held their breath as they waited for Catherine to reveal her decision. Would she return to Marcus, armed with new understanding about their relationship's true dynamics? Would she commit fully to Richard, acknowledging his generous spirit and mature love? The possibilities seemed equally compelling and equally fraught with complexity. But Catherine's next words revealed a choice that no one had anticipated. "I can't marry either of you," she said, her voice growing stronger as she found the courage to voice a truth that felt both terrifying and liberating. "Not because I don't love you both, but because I finally understand that I need to learn how to be alone before I can learn how to be truly partnered with anyone." The confession sent ripples of shock through the crowd. In their social circle, where marriage was often seen as the ultimate measure of personal success, choosing solitude over partnership was almost incomprehensible. "I've spent my entire adult life defining myself in relation to the men I've loved," Catherine continued. "First as Marcus's wife, trying to fit into his ambitious world, then as Richard's fiancée, trying to create a safe alternative to that challenge. But I've never learned who I am when I'm not performing a role for someone else's benefit." Dr. Webb nodded knowingly from his position in the crowd. As a physician who had counseled many patients through relationship crises, he recognized the wisdom in Catherine's decision, even if it defied conventional expectations. Marcus found himself feeling simultaneously disappointed and proud as he processed Catherine's choice. The selfish part of him had hoped for reconciliation, but the part that truly loved her recognized the courage required for such radical self-examination. "Catherine," Marcus said gently, "that might be the bravest thing any of us has said tonight. And that's saying something, considering everything we've shared." Richard stepped forward, his expression reflecting a complex mixture of sadness and respect. "I won't pretend I'm not disappointed," he admitted. "But I can't argue with your logic. We both fell in love with versions of you that you were performing rather than the person you actually are. Maybe it's time for all three of us to figure out who we really are when we're not trying to be what someone else needs." The crowd watched in fascination as the three people at the center of the evening's drama reached a resolution that none of them had expected. There would be no fairy tale reconciliation, no dramatic gesture of romantic triumph. Instead, there was something rarer and more valuable. Three people choosing authenticity over convenience, growth over safety, and truth over the comfortable lies that had shaped their relationships. Mrs. Davidson stepped forward from the crowd, her face reflecting the pride of a mother who had just watched her daughter demonstrate wisdom beyond her years. "Catherine, what you're choosing is going to be difficult, but it's also going to make you the kind of person who can build the extraordinary relationship you deserve." Jennifer moved to her sister's side, tears streaming down her face as she recognized the magnitude of Catherine's decision. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Scared for you, but proud." As the evening wound toward its conclusion, the guests began to disperse slowly, many of them walking in pairs and engaging in the kind of deep conversations about their own relationships that the night's revelations had inspired. The confrontation that had threatened to destroy a wedding had instead created a community-wide examination of the foundations of successful partnerships. Marcus approached Catherine one final time, his expression filled with the kind of mature affection that transcended romantic possession. "Catherine, if you ever decide you're ready to try building something together again, not as the people we used to be, but as whoever we become, I hope you'll let me know." Catherine smiled through her tears, recognizing in Marcus's words the kind of patient, unconditional support that authentic love required. "And Marcus, if you find someone who can match your passion and vision from the beginning, someone who doesn't need to be rescued from her own limitations, I hope you'll be brave enough to build something extraordinary with her." Richard joined them for a final moment of connection, his silver hair catching the light from the Japanese lanterns. "I have a feeling," he said with a smile that contained both sadness and hope, "that all three of us are going to be just fine. Better than fine, actually. We're going to be real." As the last of the wedding guests departed into the California night, Marcus Chen, Richard Blackwood, and Catherine Davidson stood together on the lawn of the Beverly Hills Country Club. no longer bound by the roles they had been playing, but connected by the profound honesty they had shared. The millionaire black belt had come to fight for his ex-wife's attention and discovered instead the value of fighting for truth, authenticity, and the courage to become the best versions of themselves. The evening that had begun with the promise of violence had ended with something far more powerful: the possibility of transformation, growth, and the kind of mature love that could only exist between people brave enough to be completely honest about who they really were.